Good afternoon. I'm Andy Barron, and I'm excited to introduce our next presenter to you, Raul Vasquez. Raul is a native of Texas, and after growing up, he ventured west and attended college at Stanford, where he earned his undergraduate and a master's degree in industrial engineering from Stanford. He also has a degree from the Wharton School of Business in Pennsylvania, and he currently resides in the San Francisco Bay Area. After school, Raul spent some time in the healthcare industries and in consulting. He also spent several years in startup e-commerce businesses. He joined Walmart in 2002, and several years after that, became president and CEO of our Walmart.com business in the U.S. A couple of years ago, Raul was named president of our Western division of our store operations. He was in charge of all the stores in the western part of the country, about 350,000 associates, as well as all real estate, HR, and public relation functions for the West. Today, or just a few months ago, Raul went back to the .com side of the business, and he was named Executive Vice President of Walmart's global e-commerce business, in charge of global e-commerce in all the countries we do business in. It's one of our most exciting and fastest growing businesses. He's one of our top young talents at Walmart, and he's a friend and a great business partner. So y'all help me give a warm University of Arizona welcome to Raul Vasquez.
Thank you. That was really kind. Good afternoon. So what I'm going to try to do is just have a conversation about how the customer is changing today, the impact that that's having on retail, and then share a few thoughts on innovation. I've been in the e-commerce space now for a dozen years or so. I was at two companies that basically created their space, had first mover advantage, and not one line of code remains from all the work that we did in those companies. So I certainly have quite a few scars and experiences with innovation, and I'll try to share some of that with you, and then leave space and time for questions. Next slide, please. See, innovation does have its challenges. One of the things that Andy told me was that there are quite a few students here, and that one of the things that I guess the school is trying to do is to help people understand that retail is a good career and an interesting career. And I agree with the comments that were made just before I came up here. I think retail right now is at an incredibly interesting time. These are just articles from today. Just today, just as I was finishing this presentation and thinking about how to structure the presentation, these three articles I think are an indication of how the customer is changing and how those changes on the customer's part are driving changes in business. Right, the top one is about YouTube, something that one could argue has been phenomenally successful when you think about the amount of traffic it has, the presence it has, the mindshare it has in all of our lives, and already they're thinking about changing the structure of that site, moving more to channels, because they want to be prepared for when people start buying even more internet-connected televisions, Blu-ray players, and YouTube can be present there in the living room. So getting way ahead of a trend that's coming. The second one is about cable TV, and the fact that the cable TV companies want to try to figure out, even with all the structure that exists in the marketplace, how is it that they develop a more direct connection with the customer and serve the customer's desire for mobility with iPads, for example. All of these things are important. The third one is certainly about Dish. They just won the auction for Blockbuster. Blockbuster, with, as I'm sure many of you remember, going to Blockbuster, renting discs, right, declared bankruptcy, now was bought for a song by Dish. And all of them are examples of how retail continues to change and how even a company like us is affected by every single one of these changes. And many companies are, right? For us, if you think about that bottom one, Netflix and Blockbuster, Netflix just announced, for example, that they're going to start streaming Mad Men. That impacts our sales of box sets of Mad Men, right? So as the customer changes and as they've got these options, it impacts our sales. Certainly the middle one is customers start to buy more of these apps and develop more needs and uses for these apps, right? It impacts our sales of laptops. It impacts how we try to sell other product to them. And then if you think about YouTube, right, and the consumption of media on YouTube, that impacts our business as well in music and movies and games as customers get more and more comfortable working with these devices as opposed to coming into our stores and buying some of those products. Next slide, please. So as we go through this, what will be interesting is I'm going to try to approach it from two perspectives. This is an interesting quote, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it works for this deck. business is only two functions, marketing and innovation. The marketing part is someone that came up through marketing, I agree with, because if you're in retail, right, what you try to do is you try to understand how consumers make choices. Right? You try to get into the mindset of a consumer, be able to influence their behavior, right, and sell your products or services. And the innovation, as was said just a second ago, the marketplace continues to evolve, and we as retailers have to figure out how do we keep reinventing ourselves so that we stay relevant to the customer. If you go to the next slide, what I'll start with is starting with that marketing component. Let's try to understand the customer. This is a simple way to just think about it, right? If you're a customer, anytime that you're thinking about going to a retailer, thinking about a relationship you're going to have with a service provider, I would argue it's a combination at a high level of these things, right? On the one hand, it's needs, right? Some marketers will tell you they can create needs. Other marketers will tell you that they can surface latent needs, but at some level, you need a customer to have a need of some kind, right? A second is money, right? And in this economy in particular, there are a lot of people that don't have money right now. They don't have as much discretionary income as they did. So no matter how good your service is, no matter how good a marketer you might be, you're going to run into a constraint that has to do with money. The important thing with money, too, I would argue, it's a zero-sum game. Right? So the innovation on YouTube's part, on our part, on Crate and Barrel's part, on QVC's part, doesn't necessarily create more money, right? So there's a battle, there's a zero-sum game that we're playing for money. I'd argue the same thing is true for time. Even as we go ahead and create more mechanisms that provide convenience to the customer, a customer still has a set amount of time that they're willing to spend in stores or willing to spend in front of a computer or their phone. And in particular, I think with today's generation, and they think differently about life-work balance and what they want to leave behind and what they want their life to mean, right? Time is an interesting thing for us to think about. How does the customer keep changing the way they think about spending their time? And the last one is mind share. I do like the idea that in people's mind, if you will, there's a billboard. And there are only so many brands that can be on that billboard. They've got different sizes, right? So it's another area where there's also a fixed capacity. There are only so many companies we're going to remember, so many companies we're going to consider, and so many companies we're going to trust. So if you take those four things, right, you mix them together, in some cases they happen in different order, what you get, if you go to the next slide then, is those then create some degree of customer loyalty. And I would tell you, as a retailer, one of the ways that I measure that is just traffic, just visits. A lot of times when we go and we go into a Walmart store, I'll be very happy if there's a lot of traffic in the store. There are a lot of people there, and we'll go to another retailer. The store may look fantastic, the products look good. If there's not a lot of traffic, something isn't working. So whether it's traffic to the store, traffic to the website, number of uses of our mobile site, and then at some point when we've got internet-connected refrigerators, the number of orders, right, that come through that, people are chuckling, I know, but it's going to happen. All of those things, I think, for me, are how I think about whether or not we're doing a good job. It can't simply be sales, because in an environment like today where we're starting to see inflation, right, the sales may mask a problem that you have. And therefore, a lot of times when I'm having conversation with our business owners in the different countries online, one of the first things that I ask is, don't just tell me how sales and profit are going. Give me a sense of what are your traffic comps? Do you have more people coming to the website? So if we go to the next slide, what I'm going to try to do is, if we're going to focus on those four things, right? We know the outcome is loyalty or traffic, visitation, but you focus on those four things. You focus to some extent on needs, money, time, and mind share. What are the dynamics in play right now? What are the variables that are influencing those things for a customer? If you go to the first one, what I would argue is new business models. Right? Even if you didn't have the internet, even if you didn't have other things that continue to accelerate in terms of innovation, there's creativity in business models, right? Netflix, I think, is a great example. There certainly was a component of the element to that, but the idea of putting these things in envelopes, right, and then sending them through the mail, it was a great idea and it changed the business model, but it had nothing to do with mobile, it had nothing to do with broadband penetration, right? It was just a great new idea in terms of how you capture value from the customer. If you go to the next slide, you'll see an interesting quote today from the paper. This is the Dish CEO who just won the auction right for Best Buy. He says, my kids are crazy that I'm in pay TV because they don't pay for TV. And it's just an example of how these business models, right? What YouTube does is they give you the content for free, and Hulu does as well, and then they seek to make money through advertising. That's just a different business model. That business model, however, affects whether a person thinks they need to pay for TV, right? It affects how often they come into our stores if they're watching Arrested Development or they're watching Mad Men or they're watching Family Guy or other things like that, right? So all of those new business models, the innovation that is taking place there, if you go to the next slide, impacts then that needs money and time. Demographics are another thing. I have an 8-year-old and I have a 6-year-old. The things that they love spending time with are my iPad, my iPhone, right? And they're never going to know a world where those things didn't exist, right? So if you think about just the demographic shift that is happening, that cohort that is coming, that group is going to have a very different set of expectations about what products they need, how they get those products, and how much money they're willing to spend on them. Right? It was the same idea that CEO, the Dish CEO, was trying to express. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see is another one. High broadband penetration is one. We've all now become so accustomed to getting content quickly, to getting it easily, whether it's information on products at Crate & Barrel, whether it's reviews and ratings, whether it's looking at prices. And the other thing that really impacts me that I care about, broadband's not cheap. So there's a certain amount of discretionary income that a customer has already said, you're not going to get that money because I'm going to spend that money on my cell phone and I'm going to spend it on my cable and I'm going to spend it on my internet connection. So in that zero-sum game, again, for money, right, this is something that continues to impact the consumer and impacts us as retailers. Next slide, what you'll see is price transparency. I alluded to that just a second ago. One of the analogies that I've heard in retail that I like is the idea that for all of us that are store-based retailers, there was a time where the hard work was getting a customer to consider you, get them to drive to your store, and then once they were in your store, you were golden. Right? Because then, I mean, they weren't going to get back in their car and drive somewhere else. But the issue now is that these mobile technologies, right, and the information that's available has made our walls porous. Right? A customer comes in now and is very much still in control. When they take out their phone, they use a UPC scanner, right? They scan a product that you've taken a lot of time, energy, and care to get it onto the shelf. They scan it, and then they decide that they're not going to get it there. A huge disruptive technology for all of our businesses. If you go to the next slide, these I'm going to go through a little bit quicker. I had an interesting conversation with someone once, and they talked about the impact that the 4 O's were going to have. So I'm going to run through the 4 O's, and they need to come up with a better organizing principle because the O's are all over the place. But the first one is social. And I probably don't need to talk that much about this. If you think about Facebook, you think about the fact that it is the most trafficked website. One of the stats I saw was 70% of Americans that use Facebook check it every single day. They get 100 million pictures uploaded a day. All of those stats to me are interesting because in a world with a finite amount of time, and if you care about traffic and where people congregate, there are a lot of people spending a lot of time on Facebook. And they're an incredibly innovative company that keeps tinkering with things and keeps trying things. But when you've got that many people there, eventually you're going to find a way to impact commerce and find a way to monetize that traffic base. So social is one of the 4 O's and a big one. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see is mobile, right? We just talked about the impact that has in terms of a store and price transparency. But really, what's amazing, I think, about the iPhone is we're carrying around small computers in our pockets now. And the same is true of the Android devices. I read a statistic the other day that in Q4 of last year, more smartphones were sold than computers. So if you think about the platform that is being created, the way that consumers, and again, if you think about the future generation in particular, and how they're becoming accustomed to carrying these small computers around, and the impact that that's going to have on retail or access to information, it's going to be dramatic. The third O is going to be, next slide please, local. And I'll run through examples right now of local, but I think the best examples are certainly the incredible business that has been established by Groupon and the one that's been established by Living Social. Right, so the rumor is that Groupon's going to go public this year at a very, very large valuation, I'm sure. I saw yesterday that Living Social just raised another $400 million. They've reportedly already achieved sales of $1 billion. And again, right, those are $1 billion that I'm not going to get to, that the Crate & Barrel person's not going to get to, right? And there's only so many facials and massages and fitness things you can do, right, without starting to run out of the free time also that you have available to go shopping and to do other activities. Then you take into account what Google, right, is trying, what Bing are trying to do with local, and how they're trying to enable local product search. So that when you're on the run and you want a product, it'll tell you, you know what, these following stores around you have it, here are the prices, now you pick where you want to go. But instead of all that great work that we've done as a brand to try to get people to naturally think of us, right, to have that high degree of mind share naturally, now we're going to have intermediaries that are trying to steer people one direction or another. The last, though, then, is personal. And in particular, how is it that you create highly relevant, personalized experiences for people? And I'll go through examples of that. If you go to the next slide, what I think is interesting about those 4 O's, and where I had a fun conversation with this person, is and this is why innovation is so much fun, is there's an interaction effect between all of these things. All the things that I just talked about, you can't look at them in isolation, right? You can't look at just price transparency. You have to look at the fact that people are achieving it with the phone in your store. You can't just look at social. You have to look at the ability to take your social graph, all the information you know about these other people, and then create a highly personalized experience, right? That interaction, not just of these 4 things, but of all the things we talked about and things I'm sure I forgot to put on the circles so that way people could read it, those are the ones that are going to present incredible innovation opportunities for all of us in the retail business. And the great thing is, as consumers, we're going to win regardless of what happens. I'll show you some examples of this just to make it a bit more concrete. If you go to the next slide, what you're going to see, on our website, we continue to try to figure out how to innovate, and this is an example of personal and local. So the iPad 2 is a product we sell and we have in stock. If you look over there in the right-hand corner next to my cart, it basically says my store is the Mountain View store. That's the closest store to where I live. And as I navigate through the website, what happens is that I'm able to show you the inventory that is available of the particular product you're looking at, not just online, but I'm able to show it to you in the store in case you want to go into the store. And then the personalized piece, a lot of us have become accustomed to it, right? So much so that we don't think about the fact that the website, this is a slightly different frame that I put over there. It's showing me a book that I looked at recently because I was on the phone and someone recommended it. While I was on the phone, I typed it up, looked at it on the website, put it in my cart. Right, it's showing me the item that today is the value of the day. And these things we've started to take for granted, but they were incredible innovations because the last time that you had an experience like that in a physical store was probably at a boutique that you visit with a high degree of frequency, where you walk in and someone says, oh, hi, Sandy, you know, that thing that you were asking me about, we've got it now. They'll remember what it was that you were interested in. Websites do that, and in many ways, that's why consumers today, when you ask them what their favorite retail experiences are, they list online companies. One could argue it is a superior customer experience online because of elements of personalization and convenience. The great thing from a multi-channel perspective is we have immediacy and we have a physical presence that is easy to get to. But this is an example of how we try to take the personalization component, and then combine it with the local element of where our stores are. If you go to the next slide, I'll show you another one, and I promise this will be the last Walmart one, where we're also trying to do the same thing with mobile and local. So I did this earlier today. I took that same idea of the iPad. I was in a conference last week, and there was someone from Mexico that really wanted an iPad, and they just couldn't find it in Mexico. So they were going to drive around through all the Apple stores, and there are lines outside the Apple store in my neighborhood every day, so I said, there's no way you're going to find it. But it's a great use case. So I was in my room, I looked it up on my phone, you can see the iPad 2, and then I said, okay, show me where it is in the stores that are around us. That's an incredible piece of technology that we've just taken for granted. We're not the only ones that do it, obviously, right? But if you think about just how much easier life has gotten, when I was a kid, right, my mom asked me to do something like that, I'd pick up the phone and I'd be dialing 6 or 7 places, I'd be on hold, you weren't sure it was going to be there, and look how easy it is. 2 simple screens that just tell you here's where it is, and if we wanted to, right, we could click on that little arrow and get a map. We get directions while we're in the car to get to that store. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see is an example of social and local. Best Buy, I give Best Buy a lot of credit. There are a lot of people that are skeptical right now of what their future is going to look like, but I give them a lot of credit for the courage they have in trying different things. And this is an example where within Facebook, you can go into Facebook, go on to Best Buy, you can get information in terms of your weekly ad, you can figure out what your local store is, and then you can even start shopping. And as you can see on there, I went in and started looking at these iPods. You've got the ability to ask a friend about that specific product, right? So you click on that, it's then gonna post it out to your wall. Your friends will be able to tell you about it. It may not be as helpful, right, with an iPod Touch, although for someone like my mom, I bet she would have a lot of questions. But if you think about apparel, you think about home furnishings, you think about the things that we buy generally as a social experience, right? This is pretty powerful. And this is an example of the fact that you're doing it where 500 million people are congregating. Even a small conversion percentage can be a remarkable amount of orders and sales. If you go to the next slide, what you'll see is social and personal. This one I really like. This is the idea of how would you take the Facebook information that you have, right, and combine it with planning a trip. So in this case, what TripAdvisor has done is you kind of go in there and it knows who you are because you log in with your Facebook ID. And then it gives you a sense of where are the places that your friends have gone to, did they like those locations? And as someone that is planning a trip, right, that becomes very, very valuable information. And this is what I mean by the interaction effect of all of these things, right? Then layer on price transparency on top of that, right? Imagine now if you could see the 4 places or the 4 airlines that can take you out there, 6 hotels with ratings and prices. Right, that would be a third dimension. Next slide, please. Mobile and local, we talked a little bit about this, living social, Groupon. It's interesting is the tension that starts to be created, right? I liked Groupon, I like the curated element that they used to have, because you used to go on, right, and there might be 3 choices. There was a high element of discovery. I don't have a ton of time, so the idea of just looking at 3 was pretty compelling. When I took this screenshot this morning, there were 20. I am not going to look at 20 things. I probably need a little more time and a little more patience, but the element of discovery certainly starts to kind of wear off, right, once I kind of move my finger once. But that's the sort of thing that, again, we need to figure out how is the customer evolving and what is just enough, right? 4 or 5 was probably just fine, maybe 6 or 7 was fine, and there's probably a customer set that's willing to look at 20. So how do you take mobile plus local plus personalization so that you show me 6, and the person that actually has quite a bit of time will go through 30? Next slide. I believe this is one of the last few examples. This one I find fascinating. What Facebook is trying to do here is they'll ask you simple questions, right? Polls. Polls are little bite-sized questions. They only take a certain amount of time. And in San Francisco, what they're doing is they're asking people, give me a sense of what your favorite restaurants are among the ones your friends liked already. So think about what a phenomenal marketing platform that is going to be, to not only have a sense of what your friends like already, but then to have me opt in and say, these are the restaurants that I like, right? I like Farallon, I like Chez Panisse, I like all of that. And then when I'm walking around, say San Francisco or driving around, the ability to serve me an alert and say, hey, there's a seating at Chez Panisse at 8 o'clock if you want to go by there. Highly relevant, highly convenient, right? And if it's a restaurant I haven't been to, I have my friends reducing the amount of risk that I take on in trying a new place. Next slide. This is an interesting one because the innovation continues to happen. It's not just the large companies that we've used primarily as examples. It's a lot of the small startups. There's a tiny startup called The Find, and the only thing I put here are the tabs, because if you think about the tabs, think about how ambitious they're trying to be in their vision. Right? Shop all of the web, shop what's around you, shop the stuff that's like me. Right? So what you do is you give them your kind of social information, and then you answer some questions, was my sense in looking at it. And then what it basically becomes is a personalized shopper. Shop with the information from my friends, which is this one, and then my finds, right, is, it seemed like some sense of curation, right, sense of discovery. The things that people say they like so much about going to Costco, aside from saving money, is the treasure hunt element of it. So it's another example of social, personal, and in this case, how the startups continue to innovate in this area. So next slide, please. These were meant to just be examples of what does it mean to look at all of those things that are affecting needs, money, time, and mind share, right? Because there's only so many of these we can remember. And what does it look like in a concrete fashion to see that innovation and disruption take place? So why should we care, right? I was having an interesting conversation this weekend with, he's a wonderful man. He's a really nice man that owns a shoe store. He owns a chain of shoe stores in San Francisco. And he knows that I work at Walmart, so at one point he said, so how's your business? I said, our online business is really good. And I said, Moran, how's your business? And he said, you know, we're really struggling. He said, you've got a company like Zappos that is growing at the rates that you guys are growing at, right? You've got more and more people going online doing these things. He said, and I'm trying to figure out, how do I get out there? How do I get people to know my stores, right? And they're nice stores. And he said, so what I have is I've got Groupon talking to me, right? And Groupon talks to me, and they want to take 50% of the sale. So he said, how do I make that work? Even with my margins, how do I make it work if right away I'm going to give 50% of the sale, and they're going to charge me the transaction fee on credit cards, and they have a negative cash flow on their side? I think he said it's 90 days before he gets paid, right? He said, so what do I do with that? He said, I guess I could look at Google, right? He said, I've got Google. Google's coming to me. They're talking about this little box that they want to put in my store. He said, I don't even know exactly what that little box is going to do. He said, they want me to scan every product on the way out. If I scan every product, what ends up happening is then I show up in Google Local Search. Great, right? He said, I want to show up in Google Local Search. They want over 20% of the margin. I'm sorry, they want 20% of the sale, right? So that's going to come right off of his margins, right? And then he says, so I start thinking about how am I going to make all of that work, while at the same time, I've got 2 or 3 employees in the store. I have quite a bit of inventory in case people want to come in, right? Because to date, I've survived on service. And I live in San Francisco that has certain requirements for businesses there in terms of healthcare, in terms of public transportation, of all of those things. And I mean, he's a very nice man, right? So I said, it's going to get easier, fortunately. And I started walking him through some of the things that I'm going to walk you through. Because what was interesting was, as I left my meeting with him that day, I realized that, frankly, the same conversation I had with him is the conversation that we're having internally. And it's the conversation that I think every retailer needs to have. Because I think we look at all the things we talked about with a sense of wonder and amazement as consumers, as we should. But a lot of times we don't connect the dots to what's coming for us as businesses. If you go to the next slide. The first thing, there are going to be winners and losers. Some people are going to ride this wave, and it's going to be phenomenal for them. But if you do believe it's a zero-sum game, it means there will be losers. And one of the first places where I think we're going to feel that pressure is going to be the top line. If you think about it, right, what all these tools are going to do is they're going to increase the amount of choice and visibility that a customer has. Anytime you have that, with the right of information, with the right amount of information, ratings, reviews, giving you a sense of what your friends know and trust, you're going to have substitution. Once substitution happens, right, someone is losing sales, that's going to be a lot of pressure right on the top line. Every sharp business person that has a certain amount of fixed costs and assets, right, is going to say, I can't keep giving up these sales. I have to start thinking about the variable costs of these things, right? What does it cost me on the margin to get this? So now we're all going to start to feel margin pressure, right? Because we're going to start spending a lot more, not only to acquire new customers, right? In this case, sure, Google, I'll pay you the 20%, or sure, Groupon, I'll pay you the 50%, right? Because I'm interested in acquiring these new customers, and I've got a lot of faith in my ability to retain them. But for every new customer that someone is acquiring, some other person is spending a lot of money to try to retain that customer that they've spent a lot of time developing a relationship with. So now you're dealing with top-line pressure and you're dealing with margin pressure, right? The next thing then, if you're a glass half full person like I am and all of us hopefully are, right, you start thinking, well, this isn't going to work. I need to start thinking about innovation. I need to figure out how to differentiate myself in the market. Because from a macroeconomic perspective, right, people say only 2 models work. You're either the low-cost provider or you highly differentiate. Anywhere in the middle, it's just a matter of time before you get squeezed. So that third one, that third implication is everyone's going to have to start putting on their strategic hat, their marketing hat, and think about how do I bundle things together? How do I create a set of services that Zappos isn't going to be able to do? How do I put something together that allows me to get out there without having to rely on a Living Social or a Groupon? That's going to be a wonderful thing, the innovation itself. But a lot of people aren't going to be able to get that done, and then the last one is going to be the painful one, right? As everyone realizes that what they need to do is they need to be able to go down market in terms of margins, and that is one of the most painful exercises that exists in business. People are going to look at their cost structure, and they're going to have layoffs. They're going to get rid of services. Charitable donations are going to go down. Everyone's going to think about what is it that my brand truly stands for and what is it that customers really care about that they're willing to pay for and that will drive choice. And in a situation like the one we're in right now, from a just national perspective and around the world, this is going to be very, very painful for employees. Go to the next slide. what you'll see then, and this will be my last section, and then I'll open it up for questions, are just a few thoughts regarding innovation. Some of them are fairly obvious. Some of them may just be a slightly different way to think about something or to express it that may make sense to people. If you go to the first one, this is one of my favorite ones because it applies to business. People talk about it really only in terms of the Galapagos Islands and that sort of thing. But for those of you in the back, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And hopefully what the very beginning of my presentation did, and what the fact that almost everyone in this room is walking around with a computer in their bag or their pocket, we are in a world of incredible change. It makes it a fascinating time to be in retail. I love the innovative part of my job. But you have to recognize, right, that the whole ecosystem that you're a part of is under attack right now by people that are innovating and are bringing disruptive technologies to the table. You have to change. You have to have those conversations within your company. Go to the next slide. Interesting is you start to think about, okay, well, why is there so much resistance to change? And as I said, I've spent 12, 13 years in this area, and I love this Faulkner quote. One of the reasons that people resist so much, right, is because the past was so good. You were so successful in the past, you were nailing it, you had a sense. In many cases, what we've seen, right, is CEOs come back from the past. Some of them lead the company that they were a part of to a new level of success, but many of them fail. We just hear a lot about the ones that succeed, and they write books and other things like that. We put them on platforms as we should, right? But we don't ever hear about the ones that failed. And frankly, I think it's because at times we embrace the past too much. And this Faulkner quote, I think, is a great example of why we do. Because it's never gone. It's never past, dead and buried, right? It's not even past. And I've seen it in every industry I've been a part of that the internet starts to change, is you've got some people that just decide, I am going to dig in my heels and I'm not going to change. That is not a recipe for success, in my opinion. If you go to the next slide, this is a Churchill quote, and someone sent this to me the other day. One of the books that I would recommend to all of you that have an interest in innovation is The Innovator's Dilemma. You're going to see a quote from that in a second, and it really speaks to why some companies do a very good job of addressing disruptive technologies and changes in their industry and why some fail. And I gave it to one of my direct reports recently, and he sent this quote to me, which I really liked. It's a Churchill quote that obviously was used in a very different situation, but I think it applies nonetheless. The era of procrastination, of half measures, of soothing and baffling expedients, of delays is coming to a close. The last sentence is what I really like. In its place, we are entering a period of consequences. And I would argue that for anyone that is part of a large corporation or a small corporation, where people depend on you for their livelihood, they depend on you to help make their dreams come true, not just for them, but for their children, there are very serious consequences in this. Right? Ask any of the people that worked at Blockbuster, ask any of the people that worked at Circuit City, at Linens and things. Right? There are serious consequences to choosing not to innovate and to choosing to decide that you don't need to change. If you go to the next slide, one of the things that I try to do is just to try to get people to start trying things. The earlier speaker said this too, right? You have to tinker, you have to experiment, you have to try different things. I like this Roosevelt quote, right? It's common sense, take a method and try it. If it fails, just admit it. One of the challenges, I think, is as people get higher and higher in the organization, ego gets bigger, you expect to actually get up to the plate and bat, I guess, 900, maybe 1,000, but it's not possible. You're going to fail. It's just table stakes in innovation. So I think the important part is you try something, if it doesn't work, you admit it, you move on and you try something else. But as I said earlier, right, the clear thing that needs to happen is you have to try something. The last two quotes, this one's a long one. This one is from The Innovator's Dilemma. I'll give people a second. And this one is really, really important because in a lot of retail businesses, what you have is you have mature businesses with very, very good business people running them and sound processes for how you make decisions about how to allocate money and resources. And what ends up happening a lot of times with innovations is that, you've got this great process at processing apples, and then someone shows up with a pineapple, right? And people just go, well, it's got kind of apple in it, let's just run it through the same process. And it's not possible. It's a fundamentally different thing. And this quote does a great job of saying, in companies whose investment processes demand quantifications of market size, financial returns before they can enter a market, they get paralyzed when they're faced with disruptive technologies. Not a criticism, it's just that what they do phenomenally well, right? So they want to make everything look like that. This has happened to me frequently, even within Walmart. That people will say, well, let's run a pro forma and let's have it look like the same returns that we have in a store. Well, it's not a store. It's got a different set of investments. It's going to have a different life cycle. So the second part is the important one, right, of just realizing that in those processes, you'll demand market data. None of it exists. In many cases, it's a brand new idea, right? That's what makes it innovative. So you can't have that, and you're going to want to make judgments on financial projections when you can't know what the revenue and costs are going to be. I am not saying pro formas are not valuable. Let me be clear about that. Before I get an email from my boss, pro formas are incredibly valuable, but the one thing I generally tell people is at some point you put your pencils down, because the only thing you know for sure with that pro forma is it's wrong. It's the only thing I know with 100% certainty is that's wrong. So we use it, if you go to the next slide, to guide us. And the last thought I would leave you with, and it's one of the things that I've learned, is you don't need to have all the answers to start the journey. The work will guide you. If you have a smart group of people, a diverse group of people that have different experiences, if you challenge each other, and if you truly listen to the customer, and you come from a place of not being afraid of failure, the work will guide you. And you may end up in a different place than where you thought you were going at the beginning, but it's a wonderful journey, and you can end up creating something beautiful for the customer. Next slide. Thank you for your time. Sure, I think we do have time for questions, right? Yes.
Raul, thank you for your presentation. That was excellent.
Oh, thank you.
Listening to you speak about the e-com part of Walmart's business, we would think we're talking to one of the most innovative retailers on the planet. But that was an incredible presentation. On the flip side, in your stores, it's a different experience. And you have nearly 2 million employees globally. How are you going to translate this incredibly innovative and advanced approach to retail in the social, mobile, and other areas to what's in the store? And part of our audience has talked about experiences that we've had, and you're going to experience the same that others have had. Is, you know, if you go into a Walmart store and you have a mobile device and you scan an image and you want to learn more about that device,
right,
you'll likely have an employee tell you, put that away or I'm going to take it away. And so there's a disconnect.
Sure.
And how are people in the stores going to raise up to the environment that people want to use and shop when they're in their stores?
So there were a lot of questions in there. I'll try to take them in the order I remember. If I miss something, please let me know. The last one is the one I'll start with. I think it was Lee Scott at one point, our former CEO, when we were talking about something in one of our offices, he said our population is 4 million people. I think Tucson, someone told me, is about 1 million, something like that. Someone told me San Antonio is also about that, about the size of our population. And the only reason I bring that up is when you go to San Antonio, when you come to Tucson, are you going to find people that are doing things you hope they wouldn't do? Yes, right? But over time, what you try to do is you try to reinforce through culture, right, and through information, the behaviors that you're looking for. And I can say this, having spent last year, right, with responsibility for a third of the stores, that there are situations where you're right. Someone will go up and they'll say, I'm sorry, ma'am, you can't do that, right? Or I'm sorry, sir, you're not supposed to do that. And every time I hear that, I have to get on a stage like this and tell a story about the fact that we have to embrace change, the same thing we just talked about right now, right? Because if not, what's going to happen is that customer isn't going to want to come back to the store, right? So I may have lost now potentially the sale of that one item versus losing a history of goodwill over 49 years that we've been in business. So that's, and we're not perfect, we're nowhere near where we need to be. Please don't hear me disagreeing with you, because I know it happens. It's probably happening right now. But it's the sort of thing, right, that Andy and the operators and I and everyone else, when we're in stores, we're trying to reinforce the behaviors that we want, and it takes time. On your other part of to what extent does Walmart and the stores represent the kind of innovation that we're talking about? It's a journey. So I would tell you our site-to-store program, which we rolled out a few years ago, is the largest of its kind. The number of items that we are able to send into such a variety of stores all over the US was a truly innovative idea, in particular in its execution, right? Pickup Today is a program that we're announcing, that we've announced and we're starting the national rollout of, and that's the ability through your computer, through a mobile device, to basically say, I want that item that is on the shelf, go get it for me, I'm gonna pick it up in a few hours. Again, the ability to do it in our number of stores across so many categories is really hard, and those are the areas that we're innovating in. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to embrace the idea that the walls are porous, and we're trying to go through the exercise of looking at our cost structure, thinking about what services are most important, and how we embrace all of that. It's a tricky thing, right? If you think about the amount of capital we've got invested in these stores and these associates, right? And the responsibility that we feel for their livelihood, right? We are trying to embrace that and to say, how do we use all of these assets? How do we use our supply chain, our store base, our heritage, our price positioning to win in this new world? But I'd say it's the second or third inning.
Thank you very much.
Well, I was wondering, I provide analytics for a large retail corporation. You must have access to tons of data and lots of experience with integration and so forth. What are the key analytics, data touch points, everything related that you look at every day? Do you have a top 10? You have access, I'm sure, to all kinds of reports, so do many other people in this room. But what key e-com metrics, analytics do you look at every day? For our department, we're currently designing a new dashboard report. So just curious about your thoughts.
So I'll give you a couple of thoughts. Some of them may seem a little counterintuitive, especially given the reputation we have as a company. We've got a report called Summary Metrics that comes out every day, and it has a lot of information, right? So it's got what our sales were relative to plan, actuals relative to plan, relative to last year, margin like that, visits like that, the number of site-to-store orders, the number of Pickup Today orders. I mean, it's quite a bit. What I look at how our sales comp was, because how you do relative to plan has to do where you set the plan, right? How you do relative to last year is a much better indication of what is going on with your business. I look at traffic. Going back to what I talked about earlier, traffic is one of the things I always look at. I look at conversion, I look at average order size. I look at the things that give me a sense of when you were a customer, how many of you came in, how many of you liked something that you saw, and how much did you spend while we were in the store?
Thank you.
At a high level, I look at those. The part that's gonna seem counterintuitive is I've learned over the years to spend less time looking at the day-to-day. What is most valuable to me is looking at how we're doing week to date, how we're doing month to date, and how we're doing year to date. So what we've really tried to do in managing our business is to come up with those dashboards, right? So I'll glance at the day, I wanna look at it week over week for a while, and then I wanna look at it on a monthly basis, and then I wanna see how I'm doing for the year, right? And one of the things that I think is fascinating about retail is retail requires both a good strategic mind and a great analytical mind. Some of the people that do best in our company, I think, are people that are trained in areas that have to do with critical reasoning, with logic, and that can think about trends and can process numbers and see what is happening behind the numbers. So that's what, there was a point, and I remember this clearly, where we would have a lot of emails. Well, what is it that happened yesterday?
We get those too.
Yeah, I want to understand that maybe, but if we still look pretty good week to date, and if tomorrow looks better than yesterday, then we wasted a lot of time just thinking about yesterday. I really care if yesterday was bad, today is bad, and the last 3 or 4 years, or the last 3 or 4 days have been bad, because then there might be something that you really need to understand.
Thanks.
Uh-huh.
I
Yes.
have a question. You just addressed that you are a differentiator or a cost leader, but you are trying to play both strategies at the same time with the new formats, the new stores. Are you going to do that, playing cost leader and differentiator at the same time?
It's very hard to do. So to answer the question, if I understood you correctly, has to do with that macroeconomic choice, right? Of do you differentiate or do you go for cost? The thing that I've tried to really be good at, and I've had people challenge me on this, is making sure that at times you don't make false choices. What I mean by that is there are some things that don't have to be an either or, right? If you really challenge yourself, and this is what we try to do, because of our scale, there are some things you can differentiate at that don't increase cost, right? Because we can spread it across 4,000 stores here, and my responsibilities are global. So sometimes I look at the cost of differentiation, to your question, and I say, we can actually use this in Canada, in the UK, in Mexico, in South Africa soon. And in that case, we are able to differentiate and do it in a way that doesn't allow someone to touch us from a cost perspective. The challenge, right, and where we try to be very disciplined, is when someone comes to with us with an idea that the costs increase linearly, right? Every customer that uses it is going to cost you more. Those are the ones we don't take. Because we won't win. We'll get stuck in the middle then, and anyone that's in the middle ends up losing at some point.
Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Rahul,
Yes.
Great presentation.
Well, thank you.
I was expecting a fifth O, actually, which is global, which is part of your
yes.
title. So
I ran out of circles. It was gonna, the one thing that was driving me crazy, did you notice how I had to hyphenate demographics from an aesthetic perspective? It was like, oh, I played with fonts, I tried to make this, yet yes, global for the reason go ahead, I'm sorry.
One option could be global, actually, which would cover local and global at the same time, which is one of the challenges you have. But my question to you is, how does Walmart.com support Walmart's global strategy, supporting the different countries you're in, or expanding into new countries?
So the question is, how do we support the Walmart strategy, and then how do we support the idea of the global ambitions that we have as well? I think there are a couple of ways. The first is with the conversation that we had at the beginning of how do we think about services that combine the channels? How do we think about using the supply chain? How do we think about giving customers information in the stores? For some of you that are familiar with versions of Yelp, I think it's Yelp Monocle, Google Goggles is another one. There are some crazy ideas we have, right? That what if you turned on the camera function on your phone and you started kind of just looking around the store, right? And you could see beyond what your sight line is, in particular because some women are shorter than I am, right? You could have a sense of what's back there, and you could do wayfinding, right, with your phone without having to ask someone for information. Or else, right, you could pull up this and either use the barcode scanner or just look at it with your camera, right, and bring up a wealth of information. For us, the low-cost element in the store comes from being primarily a self-service environment. So this technology can give us a very scalable, low-cost way of helping address that challenge in the stores. The most common question we get in a store, for example, is where is blank? We know how to solve that. We're working on that right now, right? It'll be a version of the Maps functionality that we all use, right? Tell me you're looking for a vacuum cleaner. You are here, the vacuum cleaner's over there. Those are the ways that we think we can complement the stores, not just the services, but also the information that we can provide in the store. On the global side, it's a few things. So what Walmart.com can do is we are the most developed general merchandise business that Walmart has. So in my role, we're helping Canada reach the level of development that we have. We're helping the UK reach that level of development, working with Japan on that level of development. Every country's good at something else. The UK is our most developed grocery business online, right? So we're trying to take elements of what the UK does and bring it to the other countries around the world so we don't reinvent the wheel. And then we believe that because of the asset commitment that you need to make for online being so much lower, the capital commitment, than for stores, there are probably opportunities for us to go into markets that we don't have stores in. And that, to me, is really exciting. Thanks for your question.
Just touching on what you just said, have you guys thought about like a fresh direct approach to things for larger metropolitan cities? I live in New York. I grew up in Fayetteville, Arkansas.
Oh, you did?
And
okay.
so I grew up with Walmart.
Yes.
I don't have one now, but I use Fresh Direct because I can't carry a case of water on the subway. So I just wondered if you guys have thought about that or teetered with it at all.
I think about a lot of crazy things. And I think one of the challenges in the US is Webvan was so early and spent so much money that any good business person is a little gun shy, right? Just when it comes to grocery delivery. I know some of the people at Fresh Direct. I have good friends in New York that use the service. I used Webvan, so from a consumer perspective, I get it. So I've certainly thought about it. It's something that we discuss now and then, but so much money was spent at Webvan that good business people, right? If we go back to the slide I showed, have a lot of nervousness about it. Anyone that wants it, if you can shoot an email to me, I'll try to say, especially if you were from Arkansas or anywhere else that we've got stores, I'll try to use you as part of my case to go ahead and do grocery delivery. We can think of it as our role in fostering innovation. Any other questions?
Raul, I have a question related to innovation. And you spoke and used the quote from Clay Christensen, the
Yes.
Innovator's Dilemma, about trying to not throttle some of that.
Right.
I'm not in the retail side, but I serve retailers. I'm a product manufacturer and marketer. And innovation for us has been a lot like baseball. We tend to make more outs than we get hits in total. And so you're talking about trying to encourage innovation and not bundle it up. But there's got to be some method inside of a company of your size or inside of any company to gatekeep or throttle some of what you're investing in the way of time, energy, and leaving that creativity, especially all the way down to the associates in the store. When you're touching the customer, that's when you want to try to create something new and different, not just from the home office. Can you share any ideas that you guys have instituted that have worked to keep the innovation at a high level without spending the family fortune before it's all over?
Right. That's a great question. So I'll share a couple of thoughts. The first is, I think certainly if you're in a business of any size, right, where you have a lot of people depending on you already, you don't want to make a bet that's going to cost you the whole farm, right? So to your point, I think one of the things you have to think about is what is the appropriate number of bets and how big can the bet be? So I am very careful in trying to figure out how do you not become so scared of protecting the business, but you realize that you have a business today that is profitable, that you've worked very hard to create that level of profit. There's a whole ecosystem around it. And in some cases, what you're talking about is a bridge to a new business model, not destroying that business model. A great example of this, I think, is what Netflix has done. Right? There were so many people that were so concerned about what was going to happen to their business, and they didn't go digital with their entire catalog at the beginning, right? They started with black and white films. They started with stuff that most of us wouldn't care that much about, but it was a way to learn, right? So that would be the first thing I would say. To your point, is there has to be some logic and reasoning to the size of the bet. The other piece is what we really tried to do at .com, and what we're trying to figure out how do you do in the stores, is you create an environment where innovation can happen in any part of the company at any level, but as the idea gets bigger and as it needs more capital, it has to flow up. And once it flows up to some steering committee, then you have the ability to say, okay, I'm going to feed it a little bit more where I want to see it change direction in this way, but you don't stifle the creativity at the beginning. And that part's very important. And for those of you that may take the time to read The Innovator's Dilemma, and it sounds like you have, right, he talks a lot about culture, right, and the fact that at times to create innovation, you have to have a different culture and you have to create an environment that will foster it. But at some point, right, even in the areas where they move the office somewhere else, that new division had to come ask for capital, right? Had to explain their strategy, had to figure out how you were going to coexist in the market. So I think that's one of the other ways you do it, whether it's innovation in operations, in the services area, in product management. That's what we've tried to do. Have I answered your question? It's tricky. I mean, it's incredibly tricky, right? And the book is full of examples of some people that failed, some people that were able to do it. Frankly, I think one of the things that helped us at Walmart.com was we were in California. And that meant that there were some things that we were willing to try and think about and dream about. And when we had a working prototype ready and we had some sense of customer demand, then we came to Bentonville, right, and said, look at this thing, isn't it amazing? Sometimes they'd say, actually, no, and here are the reasons why. And they'd have great reasons, right? And we'd say, didn't think about that. We put it back on the shelf. And there were other times where they'd say, you know what, that is really interesting. Why don't you try it in 2 stores? And then we went to 20 stores and 100 stores. I mean, we've got a pilot right now that I was presenting this week that's going into 2 stores in the next 2 weeks or so. It's really exciting. But we're not betting the farm at the beginning, right? Because the number of associates we'd have to train, the likelihood of getting it wrong would be very high. So I've also learned to be a bit more patient. Yes? If I didn't answer all of your question, just feel free to, okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Pam Thompson from Magic, and I listen to a lot of talk radio, and they used Walmart as an example the other day that there's 330 stores in China, but there's not one store in New York City or Chicago, and I was wondering if you have any future plans to be opening stores there.
We would love to have stores in Chicago or New York. I think that's all I've got to say about that. If you can send me an email too, of being a New Yorker, that would be great. We could add her to the base of support. I mean, I'll say a little bit more. We're an interesting brand. And what I mean by that is if I put on my consumer hat and my business hat, I've been with the company 8.5 years. And I understand why people are skeptical, because I think it happens in our country. I think once something gets of a certain size, there are questions, there's more scrutiny, and that's not necessarily a bad thing overall. But one of the interesting things about this company is we talk, and you see it in the commercials of save money, live better. And it's not until you really get to know the executives, and it's not until you go to Arkansas and you see the fact that our office is actually an old warehouse, that you realize how passionate people are about making a difference in people's lives. And it was one of the things I loved about my previous job. I was asked the question last night by someone, do I miss my old job? There were parts of it I loved more than I thought I would. I loved being in Montana and having an associate show you with incredible pride what she had done in the movies section. The dignity that you give someone through work and the fact that we employ 1.4 million people is a wonderful thing. But along the way, there were things that we didn't do as well as we should have. We opened ourselves up for criticism, and that has meant that it's hard to go into some of those markets. And we're trying, and we're becoming a better company. But yes, I'd like to be there because I walk around in Chicago, I walk around in New York, and I know we can make a difference in people's lives. Next question.
I have one over here.
Yes.
Just could you talk a little bit about career opportunities in your unit in Northern California, given all the students we have in the back of the room?
Yes. We love hiring people that love what we talked about. Right? What I enjoy about my job so much, aside from what we just talked about, what we just talked about, I think it makes me feel like there's purpose in what I do when I leave my 8-year-old and my 6-year-old. Right? But what I love about the stuff we all talked about is I love the art of what's possible. I love creating. I love thinking about how you make things better. And we have a lot of opportunities for people that really thrive in that environment, the people that want to reinvent retail, the people that want to be part of the future. We've got those opportunities in California because we hire for people that want to do work in Japan, that want to do work in India, that want to do work in Canada, that want to do work in the UK, in operations and marketing, product management and merchandising. In Arkansas, we do as well, because the question that was asked earlier, I think, is a great question. We're all having to become multi-channel retailers. It's not that the e-commerce people are becoming store people and the store people are becoming e-commerce people. We're having to find that middle ground where you can leverage what each is good at. A great example is in my role last year, the day after Thanksgiving, right? The number of people that go into the store and the amount of sales we do, no one does that online right now. No one does, right? So that is the strength of the physical channel that you have to try to figure out, how do we leverage that for the online channel? And people that want to play in that gray area and that ambiguous zone and that want to create, yes. Whether they're students today or if you're in another retailer or you're in another industry, please feel free to talk to me. And that's probably enough time for me. Thank you so much.